Hey, on this episode of the Ethics Experts, we talked to Sue Gainor of Great Point Consulting. She has such a really cool background working in the State Department, working in all these really cool different jobs. And we get into ultimately what it takes to create a culture of compliance where you're not just the lone voice in the wilderness, but rather we're activating people in our organization to build this culture of integrity. So I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey, bestie. Hope you're having an amazing day. The world is a better place because you're in it. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button and join us as we change the world by making our workplace better. Got a real treat for you. We got Sue Gainor today of Great Point Consulting. She's the owner-operator there, and she's the former VP of Global Trade at Boeing and Director of Defense Trade Compliance at State Department. So how's it going, Sue?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Good, yeah. So good to see you again. I saw you in Atlanta, right? Is that where we connected last?
Yes, at the Women in Compliance and Third-Party Risk Management Conference.
That was a fun time. We had a fun time at that Sparks event or Spark
really
Consulting
did.
event, and now here we are, months later. The fall is here, and you're on the Ethics Expert. So what's been going on this summer? What have you been working on?
Well, I'm supporting a client under a consent agreement, which is a challenging environment and lots of work for the company. And I bring both my hats as the former enforcement person for trade, as well as former leader at Boeing, to help the company get through the consent agreement. And then I have several other clients that I support for government relations and helping to move their authorization requests through the State Department. So yeah, it's been pretty busy.
Yeah, you know kind of all the ins, all the ins in that world. That's like a black box for so many of us,
It is, and for a lot of places and a lot of people, and in part because I worked just about everywhere in government that touches defense trade controls and compliance, and so that for me it is second nature. And because before that I was a bit what we call in DC a policy wonk, and I did international affairs and sold F-16s around Europe, and so I was able to work in a lot of different places. So for me, it's sort of natural to call into somebody in the government because I know most of the people I would be calling.
Right. Well, why don't we start there? Why don't we start with your story? Because it's so cool. It's such a cool story with so many like twists and turns, on your path to Great Point. So how did you
Well, I'm glad you
take
think
us
so.
back to a young Sue, and then we'll just go chapter by chapter.
Oh, I'd like to go back to the young Sue for lots of reasons. I had a birthday a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of those milestone birthdays, and I thought, oh my God, how did I get here? Right?
Yeah, I still feel 17, and yet this number keeps changing.
I know. I feel 42, but I am no longer 42. Let's just put it that way. So in college, I was an ROTC, and I was a international affairs kind of major. And so then I went into the Air Force through the ROTC program. And I was an intelligence officer, which I loved, focusing on the Middle East, which I loved. And then I got out of the Air Force and I went to industry, and I was a consultant for one of these larger consulting houses like a Booz Allen. In fact, I worked for Booz Allen for a little bit, but it was one of the Booz Allen SAIC competitors. And I was there about 11 years and did a lot of doctrinal work related to new weapons introductions into the military and sort of force-on-force wargaming stuff.
What was that like?
It was great. It was a super job. I worked for super people. The company was appropriate for our conversation today. So ethical. It was just a fabulous place to be, and it completely created my professional persona for me and gave me all those kind of lanes not to cross and how to function in the work environment. And I'm forever grateful to the company and the people I worked with there. In fact, I'm getting together with a bunch of them tomorrow. And I mean, these are people I've known since the late 80s. So it was a really seminal event for me, or seminal experience for me. And then from there, where did I go? I worked for there. I moved overseas with my family. We lived 5 years overseas. I was still on the Air Force Reserve, so I still did, the intelligence work. And we lived in Germany and Egypt and Kuwait and Oman, so a bunch of Middle East places, which is sort of my sweet spot. And so I was staying home with children. I worked in Germany, but in the Middle East countries, I was home with the kids. And then we came back and I went back into industry because that's where I had been. And I happened to see a job announcement for international affairs for the Air Force in the Middle East shop. And I thought, wow, that floats all of my boats. And so I applied for that, even though I had always had my mind set about not being in government, in part because the pay is lower and the workplace conditions aren't always up to snuff. And so I'd never really considered working in government, but I thought, well, this could be interesting. And I applied cold. And I didn't really know anything about the organization. I'd never heard about it. And I ended up being hired for the European division. I was the deputy director there. And that was the sort of selling F-16 jobs in Europe. And it was the first time I did outward facing, right? Intelligence jobs are collecting information and assessing what that means and then telling the leadership. And this was the first time I was interacting with the other countries that we were engaging with. And so because we had Europe, Eurasia, I had a lot of interaction with the embassies in DC, lots of travel. It was fantastic. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. And that was the first time I ever heard about export controls. And for us, we were the government, we were facilitating the sales from major aerospace and defense companies to foreign countries, but we didn't deal with the details too much. So I only learned a little. I just kind of knew it in the back of my mind, and I spent a couple of years there, and then I left and went back into industry. And I got a call from my former boss at the Air Force job, and he's like, I have the job for you. And it was with an agency that I'd never heard of in the government, a Defense Department agency called Defense Technology Security Administration. And so I said, okay, well, I'll apply because he was facilitating. And I ended up getting that job. And I became the European policy person for technology security. So what technologies would we allow to be sold through either government to government exchanges or commercial to commercial exchanges? And that was really cool. And I traveled all over and interacted with the governments a lot. And then from there, I got another one of these. Hey, you should come over to this agency, work at this agency. So I went to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which does foreign military sales, which is when the U.S. government is sort of the contractual mechanism between a company and a country. So India wants to buy this fighter jet, Lockheed Martin wants to sell it. The U.S. government facilitates the contracting and how all that works. And that was fascinating. And I ended up on the Pakistan desk, which was really fascinating because it was when Osama bin Laden was killed by the U.S. forces. It was a very interesting job. And then I went into the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, working for the chairman's staff. And then I went over got another master's at National Defense University. This is a way longer story, but the point is cool. It's like all of these kind of moves. And then I got a master's from National Defense University, and I got a call from a former boss who said, hey, we have a job opening at the State Department for the director of compliance. I had literally never heard of the office. I understood the mission of that organization, but I didn't know about the compliance job. And so I got the job and I went into that role. And it was a whole new experience. State Department and Defense Department, very different cultures, very different operating rhythms, operating norms.
Talk to me about those differences, because to me, again, it's just like this black box. I just have no idea what happens there. Like, how are those different?
So DOD, right, is very right on. Many of the civilians are former military themselves. And in almost all the offices, it's mixed civil service and military, right? And we tend to speak the same language. We tend to be very action driven. We tend to hold meetings that have specific goals for outcomes, right? Action outcomes. It's all very action oriented. And we tend we tend to be plain spoken. I might be a little more plain spoken than many, but you got a job to do and you're going to get it done. And at the State Department, it was much more about the discussion, not the outcome, but the discussion, which is very hard to adapt to if you're an Action Jackson type like I am. There were people, the culture in state was, it didn't really matter if you showed up on time for a meeting, you'd get there eventually. In the meeting, everybody would wait and everybody would be okay with it. And, I had trouble with that sometimes. And they're just, the environment is pretty different. So that was challenging. I had to really adapt kind of how I approached meetings and how I approached my colleagues in state. But my job was industry facing. So I was the leader of the organization that put companies, that interacted with companies on trade compliance violations. So companies have to disclose when they realize they've made a mistake and a violation of the regulations. And then there's some interchange between the office, the compliance specialists in the office, and the companies. And for some companies, if the violations are systemic, pervasive, super problematic, then the office can put those companies under what's called a consent agreement. And that is the company consents to monitorship and to a penalty to avoid being charged in an administrative judicial proceeding.
So what's an example of something like that? And so, I have a couple of questions about that. Was it predominantly organizations coming and saying, kind of raising their hand and saying like, hey, we screwed something up? Was that the majority of what you were dealing with?
Yes. In fact, the regulations, both the Commerce Department and State Department regulations for trade, right? Commerce regulates commercial trade, and State Department regulates defense trade. And those regulations encourage voluntary disclosures to the government if you find that you violated the regs. The regulations are hard, tricky, require lots of record keeping, and there will be a lot of missteps in a fast-paced business environment. And so you're encouraged to disclose. And for companies who end up in consent agreements, they've typically disclosed a variety of violations, and the severity, the number, the frequency, those kinds of things lead the State Department to put companies under a consent agreement.
So you were like really well suited for that job given your past experience, yeah?
Yeah.
So, so I mean, which of your past experiences, if you could even like do the attribution, really helped you the most in that role? Or was it really just this kind of amalgamation?
That's a great question. I would say it was probably an amalgamation of, a career. And also, I had very good leadership mentoring in many of the jobs that I worked. And that I had all that Air Force experience of being around leaders and leading others. And I took the compliance job largely as a leadership opportunity. And because, as I mentioned, I didn't know anything about its day-to-day work. And it really was a leadership opportunity, a challenging one for sure. And I think my mentors prepared me for that. I think my experience in all these various elements of different types of business helped. And I wasn't entirely prepared, for example, with the interaction with the Department of Justice, because there are law enforcement implications for these trade violations as well. And that was a challenging interagency experience.
Why?
Very different ethos, very different types of interactions. Arguably DOJ is the big dog on the block. And frankly, it tends to exhibit
wag its
that.
tail, yeah.
Yeah, they're not generally interested in coming to an amicable solution. I don't want to be. I shouldn't really say that, but it was a tough interaction. We interacted a lot with them, and it was tough.
It was kind of their, whatever they say goes type of thing.
Kinda, and honestly, that makes sense in a lot of ways. But in the interagency world, when you're trying to reconcile competing requirements, coming to the table and being willing to give a little to get a little is the norm.
Right.
Not always the norm when you're interacting with law enforcement.
Right. So I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about, we always talk about this concept of a J curve, like you start to do something new, like if you start trying to type, you don't just automatically start typing at a faster rate than you can hunt and peck, you go through this
Yeah.
dip, and that valley, what I call kind of the valley of despair, or that valley of death, can be very difficult. You know what I'm saying? Like as you're, again, to use my analogy, you're like typing so slow, and at some point it kind of clicks, and then you can type faster, then you can hunt and peck and so forth. And you obviously got to that point with this job where you were really kind of chugging along, but you came into a new department that had like a totally different ethos. You had different dynamics you had to, contend with. Walk me through like what that process was like. How deep was that J curve? How did you not stay in the valley of despair? What were you looking at on a higher level to kind of power yourself through those challenges in this new role? Like, again, I think you said like you had never even heard about, this type of role before.
Yeah. That's a great question. Initially, it was challenging internally because I was an external candidate, and there were internal candidates within the office that I ended up leading. So that's always a challenge, right? When you end up getting a job over people who are more familiar with the job, and wanted the job and didn't get the job. So I think that was that required some finesse. I am not the most finesse-oriented person you'll ever meet. I can be a bit of a bulldozer at times. You can ask people, but I needed to be careful with the staff and make sure that people were happy with the transition, or at least facilitating the transition. And I think for the larger part of State Department, it was a bit of a climb to kind of sort of look around the room and understand how to be successful in that environment. And I talked to a bunch of people who had State Department experience, and they gave me a lot of pointers, and which is great. I mean, it was very helpful that people were comfortable telling me kind of this is how it's going to work, or in that meeting it might have been better if you sat back a little bit and let other people, chew around them, the concepts that were at the table. So that was really helpful for me. And then there was just so much work. So we just had to put our heads down and do it. And there were things that needed to be fixed, including some of the relationship with the other partners in the interagency. And so I just sort of put my head to doing that with the team, and partnered with other organizations that were supporting the concept that I was pursuing. And that made it a lot better, because it's always better when you're in a struggle to try to get something done that some people might be resisting, is to have allies. And I sought allies, and so that helped a lot, I think, with that sort of getting up out of the hole to just sort of figure it out. And I remember initially there was so much, almost all the interaction between industry and the office was in writing, right? Because these could become legal matters, and so everything was in writing. And I remember for weeks taking home tote bags full of templates, that we had something like 300 templates for different types of letters, and I edited every single one of them. And that was a lot. But I wanted to sort of set a slightly different standard. And anyway,
And
so
what
I
did that
think
show
over
people?
time,
What do you think that showed people on your team?
I think that showed people a couple of things. One, that quality was important to me, and two, consistency is important to me, and three, uh, good writing, I think, is a key skill when your job is writing, for the most part, and communicating with people. Your communication should be clear and concise and correct. So the team was like, "Oh, she's quite the grammarian," which I am, proudly so. And I would put little yellow stickies on the papers I was reviewing, and then send them back to the staffers. And some of them had the little yellow stickies hung up all in their cubicles, because they were like, "Oh my God, I never knew this about how to write." So it irritated a bunch of people too. But I think for them, they were like, "Oh, so she's really paying attention," right? That's good, because as a new person in the office and new to the mission, you learn through both having the view of the larger sort of coast and then digging into the details. So, and I had it was a great office. We had staff that were lovely people, lovely, smart people from all over, all kinds of experiences that just really wanted to do the right thing. And then some senior folks in the office who had a lot of experience there. And it was a really good mix. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it probably also showed that like you weren't like an alligator arms person. That's somebody who just doesn't do anything, you know? They just have those little tiny arms and they're just pointing at stuff. I mean, that's a big
It doesn't take long for people to realize that I'm very action oriented.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about that dynamic because I always find that so fascinating and it's so hard to navigate through in many cases where you're an outsider coming in to take a job that other people internally that are presumably on your team or you're interacting with, you know, you took a position that like they were vying for. What was that like? Like, how were you able to win those people over and get them to be part of your, you know, alliance that you ended up building?
That's a great question. So I've done that twice. When I took the job at the Air Force, I was originally, as I mentioned, I'd never heard of it before and I didn't know the work. And people who worked for me had to train me. And one of them even said, right, these were military folks. And one of them even said, it's a little odd training my boss. And I was like, yep, we'll get past it, you know, and I'm a quick study. And, you know, once I pick it up and in terms of knowing about the job, right, the mechanisms of the job. So there's that, right? It's useful for people to help. And I think they realize quickly that I appreciate that and that I can get it quickly and it won't be a big burden on them. And then I think the second key is to respect the people who work there and who've been there and who know what they're doing and let them do what they do because they knew how to do it probably before you got there and then know how to do it after you leave. So in both those cases, it required being quick to learn the job and yet not allowing my lack of knowledge about the specific requirements to adversely affect my ability to lead the office.
Yeah, so it's kind of like being able to show competence, being able to show humility, and to show respect.
Yeah.
That's kind of the combo.
And I guess to appreciate that they're helping, right? They have to, but you don't want to make it seem like they have to. You want to be very appreciative that they're willing to bring you up to speed, especially when they also, because in the case of State Department, there were two people in the office that had applied for the job, and both of them now worked for me. Yeah. And that was challenging, but to their credit, they understood the dynamic, right? They didn't get the job. They may not have been happy about it, but they were also respectful and welcoming. And so, you know, if everybody's on board with that transition, because it is what it is, and everybody should want it to succeed, it works out pretty well.
Yeah, that's always such a challenge for folks. And it's, you know, always, you know, kind of dependent on the different players and the dynamics and the culture. But bringing that kind of, I guess that gratitude is such a piece of it because, I mean, they don't have to do anything, right? They could quit the job if they wanted, right? I mean, they're not necessarily compelled. To your point, they're more helpful when they want to be helpful.
Yes, I think that's often the case. But my experience is people want the organization to succeed. And it's not going to succeed if the leader doesn't succeed. And that if the individual members of the office don't succeed. So success for everybody is the goal because that's the only way the office can do its mission, and the mission's important.
Okay, so you were at State Department for a while. You're doing this thing. You're kind of getting up to speed. How long were you there, and what? You know, it's like you stepped into this sort of compliance realm that you were maybe on like the fringes of or doing things kind of tangential to it. What was it about this role that you were like, I really just love this?
I loved the leadership opportunities. I loved the interagency work. I had gotten the job when I had just come out of, so when I was in my last DoD job, I was selected for a leadership development program that included, it was a year-long program with a bunch of other people who were being groomed to become senior executives in government. And so we had these events that we got together and talked about leadership. And then we all got a DoD-funded master's degree through National Defense University. So when I came out of that program, out of school, DoD was the government was under sequester, and there was nobody hiring in DoD for executive positions. And to be frank, my interest in the State Department job was that it was an executive position that was available when DoD was not hiring.
Got it.
So I think I would not have necessarily joined the State Department had that not been the opportunity that presented. And I lost the thread there. Remind me of your question.
Well, while we're thinking about that, like, what do you think you were able to do as a result of having that master's from National Defense University? Like, how did that change your course within, State Department in that role? Like, had you not had those experiences and that, that time, really kind of dialed in, focused on leadership, how do you think that may have gone differently? You know what I mean?
That program also focused on interagency work, right? So I'd spent a lot of time in DoD and various agencies. I was maybe 9-10 years, but in a small community of offices that around a kind of thing, exporting stuff to other countries, and the program that included the master's degree, the leadership program, required that we do an interagency. I forget what the term is. Several months, up to 6 months, in an agency that is not your home agency.
Okay.
To
kind
widen
of like a study abroad program or something.
Yeah. Or an internship.
Yeah. Okay.
And it was meant to, because you can move up in a cone, right? You can go straight up a pole in DoD, or you can broaden. And the idea here was since it was a leadership program, you should be able to lead anywhere. And the technical expertise will come with that experience, right? So we were to broaden. And I took that to heart, and I arranged an internship, or whatever we called it, with the Department of Energy, which was, I think I was the only person that was not in the Defense Department in my selection. And I worked in the National Nuclear Security Administration, which was completely out of my lane, but I knew the mission, and I knew somebody there who helped me get that position. And that was really useful, right? Because that was a whole other environment that I had to adapt to and figure out very quickly. And it was a great experience. And so that made it easier for me to consider the State Department position, because otherwise I would have stayed in DoD in my whole career. But broadens your horizons.
Yeah, it makes you think like, oh, okay, well, maybe I can figure that out over here,
Yeah.
I think before we went on that little tangent, I was asking you, what was it about this role that you just really loved so much? And you were talking about, you like the interdepartment work, you like the leadership opportunity, and you took this job during this sort of sequesterment. Maybe that's the wrong word.
Sequester.
Yeah, the sequester.
It means DoD had no funding.
Yeah, but it was an executive position that opened, so you're like, cool, I can kind of put these new gifts that I've sort of acquired to work in that capacity.
Yes, thank you for the reminder.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I really liked about that job was interacting with industry, and frankly, was changing the way the office interacted with industry. That was one of my major goals. Industry was the office, I think, was somewhat of a black box. Things went in and not everybody knew what happened when it went in. And I am a very open, as you know, when we met, I am very open, and I'm very frank. And I came from industry. I was, to my knowledge, the only person who ever sat in that job that came from industry, that had industry background. And so there is a tendency in government, just broadly, to view industry skeptically. And in DoD in particular, many in DoD refer to industry as the other side, or in a bad way, you've gone to the other side. And so there's, that's just part of the culture. Mm-hmm. And since I came from the other side, and since this office's job was enforcement, I wanted to change the dynamic. And so I went out on a lot of speaking gigs where I stood up in front of hundreds of people and said, we are not here to bash industry. We understand this is difficult, and complying with these very complicated regulations, there will always be challenges in a complex, dynamic business environment. And I'm not here to beat you over the head. If you make a lot of mistakes, we'll put you in a consent agreement. But I don't believe industry's bad, and I'm never going to act like that. And that was new.
Yeah. What did that do to that relationship?
It did a lot. I wasn't feared. I mean, I think most people in industry knew I didn't put up with a lot of nonsense, and that if I spoke directly and tough, that they understood that I meant it. But I think being approachable was super important, and the office had not been for a long time, and it was sort of like a black box. And I'm pretty approachable. Some would say too approachable, probably, and so it really changed the dynamic. I mean, industry came to us for things, and I was asked by CEOs of companies to make videos that they could play at their leadership meetings about compliance, and I was invited to speak at industry events because I had a positive approach to industry, and I was very clear that compliance is important, but I get it that it's hard.
But there's another
And to
angle
this day,
there.
I say that.
Yeah,
I'm
but
sorry.
there's another angle there as well. And I think it's just kind of inherent to who you are. You're a very transparent person. Like you are a what you see is what you get kind of a person, and you
Yes.
don't really mince your words. And that just like reeks of authenticity. And so
Oh,
I
thank
think
you.
it feels like when you say something, I think what that translates into is like trust because people actually believe what you're saying. And I think
I hope so.
there's an interesting parallel here because that challenge that you're talking about exists in like all these microcosms within organizations where there's a compliance department that needs disclosures from the folks within the organization to understand where risks are, to fix problems, to put new processes in place, whatever. And it seems like the biggest problem that folks have sort of consistently on a broad brushstroke basis is this lack of interaction or lack of activation of these like human sensors within their organization. And it comes down to like a lack of like approachability or that feeling again within your own company that that office is a black box or that office is going to beat me over the head because I violated some kind of a policy. And I think what you did was super smart, and it started with like an understanding of what the others, the people that you were trying to influence, were actually going through. You could speak their language, and you were able to like humanize yourself because that's really what the basis of any trust is, like that sort of human connection, which obviously can come across during over a video or come across during a speech or whatever. But it's just interesting that you were able to do that from State Department across industry. And you were able to knock those walls down and get a lot more collaboration and probably fix a lot more problems than you otherwise would. And that's the same challenge that so many folks have within their organization. How can they rebrand? How can they humanize their program? And how can they make more connections to turn on these human sensors in their organization? I mean, that's the name of our game, you know?
Well, thank you for the compliment. And those are great points. And I think you're right on, right? One of the challenges in the trade compliance business, but potentially compliance writ large, is how to communicate to the business about compliance. And the trade compliance regulations, especially, are very specific, very transaction oriented, and really complicated. And the people who live in that world on the compliance side of the world, right? They're helping to get the company to comply, tend to speak the regulatory language, which when
Right.
you're in the business, you don't want to hear, well, the ITAR section 126.1 says, but that's how people tend to speak. And it's not approachable. It doesn't make you sound like you understand how the business operates. And I'm a huge proponent of understanding how the business operates at the transactional level, especially for trade compliance. If you don't know how that logistics person moves those packages
Right.
or how those imports are received and filed, and if you don't know how those people who are going to the trade show in Germany put together their materials and they don't have any export related stuff in those materials, if you don't know that, you're not very effective as a trade compliance person. And in the more broad kind of compliance area, there is a tendency, I believe, for people to talk about risk mitigation as the benchmark. That is the goal, but it's very difficult for a business person to quantify the value of risk mitigation and the value of avoiding a problem. And I think we have to be very deliberate in couching our work as enabling success. Like in the trade compliance
Right.
world, you can export your stuff because we enable that by making sure we comply. And we get your authorizations for you. We talk to the government all the time to, manage the controls that are put on the exports. We enable business. If you walk around talking about the regs, which nobody cares about but us,
Yep.
they just want to know how to do their business
Right.
compliantly. And if your only measure is you're avoiding risk, I think, talking past people for the most part. They have to be able to see the value for themselves. And if they don't, if you're doing those things I'm saying you shouldn't, then when it's time to cut overhead, they don't see the value in your positions, and they will underfund potentially, and they won't engage with you at the appropriate times, like at the point where the transaction could be going the wrong direction. And how we interact with the business, to me, is super important. And there are many trade compliance people who not sit back, I don't mean this to be negative, but who guide the business on the regs and the requirements, but they may not know how to help the business implement that within the business construct.
Which
And
comes
that, I
back
think,
to a lack of understanding, right? Like if you understand this person who you're trying to, or this department that you're trying to, guide with the regs, then you can actually guide them. But if you're just saying, well, this is what it says, kind of figure it out, that's like
Yes.
no kind of worse way to like get people to disengage. You said something just now that I think was pretty interesting. And I think, you said that if we can't show our value, then we're always going to be the first ones to be cut. But I think a lot of folks actually do think that our main value is in risk mitigation. And thus, if that's where our mindset is, then that's our framework. That's how we see the world. That's how we end up communicating either explicitly or implicitly. And we end up contributing to this self-fulfilling prophecy at some level.
Yes.
If we can shift it a little bit and we can talk about enabling the business, well, not only is that like more sexy and more, not just for sexiness' sake, but like that's more compelling, Okay, cool. I'm painting clear lines on the road to let this car drive down the road faster, driving at night. You know what I'm saying? Like that's helping to accelerate the business.
Exactly.
I think the work, let's say we had a defensive driving course that we were selling, that was our business. I would not be talking about, think of how many accidents you're going to avoid, because someone like quantify how many accidents you've avoided by taking the class.
Yeah.
It might be more it might be more exciting to say you'll be able to drive way faster. You know what I'm saying?
And get there faster.
There you go.
You'll get to your destination faster.
See, we're brainstorming our new business endeavor together right here. Our defensive driving.
Yeah. No, it's so true. It's so true. And I don't think people, the goal is risk mitigation, but it's how you couch it so other people understand why it's important, right? There's often challenges, and I'm interested in your thoughts about this too, in business where, particularly on the trade compliance side, they're like, that is somebody else's job. I'm here to do business development, right? And but you are. But in order for you to do business development, you have to have either some touch point with the trade compliance people or some knowledge so that you're not inadvertently exporting something you're not allowed to export, right? Because in my business, communications, verbal can be an export, right, to a non-U.S. party, or emails can be an export if they have in it controlled information. And so yes, your value is mitigating risk, but you have to give the business people something to hang their hat on so they understand why that's important. And to your point about the driving, nobody cares. Okay, yes, your value isn't that you set the speed limit at 55 or that you're going to be safe. The value is you get to your destination.
That's right.
Without accident, without getting a ticket, and faster than you would have gotten before, because we enabled the highway, right? We built the highway, we enabled it. it's paved, everything works, go and drive, right?
Well, I
So
think,
it can be challenging.
yeah, and it's challenging because I think we end up kind of engaging in the wrong way. This is a persuasion game. That business
Yes.
development person has to actually care about doing what you want them to do for them to
Yes.
like authentically do that. And that's only going to happen. I mean, it's carrot or stick, right? It's like, okay, cool, I'm going to get some benefit from doing that, or I just don't want to get in trouble. And I don't want to get in trouble doesn't work for all personality types because every personality type has a kind of a different lens of what risk is acceptable and where they're willing to roll the dice. And people have different, risk tolerances and so forth. But if you can, to your point, couch it as like, I'm going to help you do your job better. I'm going to help you move faster. I just think it's a much more compelling message. But I think the real benefit of it is what it requires from us in order to have that conversation, which is an understanding of the target and an understanding of like, well, what matters to that person. In order to understand what matters to that person, you have to understand what they're doing and like what their hierarchy of values are and, how they actually do their job. And once that understanding can kind of be in our brain, I mean, our brains are natural sort of goal-seeking mechanisms, we can put a lot more things together to make a more compelling case. But again, it like starts with that like empathy and that like focus on the target,
And ideally, all great points, Nick. Ideally, you get the business person to own the responsibility, right?
Right.
When the business person can say to him or herself, "Oh, I can do my job with no impediments. I don't have to stop my job because I didn't get a license because I've got all that ahead of time. So I can do my job and I don't have any of this other things that slow me down or slow my business down or make it hard." Then they become the evangelists for compliance, not the trade compliance people or the ethics people, right? If you
Exactly.
believe in your core that what you're doing is important and that compliance is enabling it, then you're the one. You become a demand signal within
That's
the
right.
business to comply. And if your company is saying, "Oh, well, that's those guys over there in compliance who speak a language we don't know," you're not going to be a very compliant company just by default, I think. But if you are able to get your business to understand why this is important, when it's important, and how it helps them do their job successfully, then you don't have to do all the work about convincing people because they're convinced and they convince others. And it's much more effective when compliance messaging comes from within the business
Right.
rather than from that function over there that we only know they speak in weird, they speak in tongue.
Right.
And it's much more effective when they are the demand signal themselves.
Well, I think that's the mic drop moment right there. I think we just solved the whole we just solved the world right there.
Thank you. That'll be $20.
Yes, $20. Check your Venmo account. All right. So, Sue, people can. What's your URL for GrayPoint?
www.graypointconsulting.com, and Gray is spelled with an E.
Properly. You spelled that properly.
Well,
done.
that's a British spelling.
Well, I would argue
Right?
that
Americans
any
have
British
any
spelling
spelling.
is probably correct.
Well, there you go. Proper British spelling.
Well, so fun to have you on. Thank you for joining us on the Ethics Experts. Until next time.